Sarah Martinez had always been fascinated by aircraft, but nobody at Westfield Aviation Academy took her seriously. At 19, she was the only female student in the advanced mechanics program, constantly overlooked by instructors who seemed to doubt her capabilities. Her classmates would snicker when she asked technical questions, and the head instructor, Mr. Harrison, barely acknowledged her presence during practical sessions. The massive hangar at Westfield housed some of the most sophisticated aircraft in the region, including a vintage 1943 P-51 Mustang that had been donated by a wealthy collector. This particular aircraft was considered the crown jewel of the Academy's collection, worth over $2 million and strictly off-limits to students. Multiple warning signs surrounded the aircraft, and Mr. Harrison had made it crystal clear during orientation that absolutely no student was permitted to touch, examine, or even breathe on the historic warbird. Sarah spent countless hours staring at the Mustang from across the hangar floor. She noticed things that others seemed to miss: the slight misalignment of the propeller, the unusual wear pattern on the landing gear, and most importantly, a faint oil stain beneath the engine that grew larger each day. Her background wasn't typical for an aviation student. She had grown up in her grandfather's auto repair shop, where she learned to diagnose problems by observation and intuition rather than textbooks. Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had been a mechanic in the Air Force during the Korean War. He had worked on similar aircraft and had passed down stories about the common issues these vintage planes faced. Sarah remembered his voice clearly. "Mija, these old birds have their own language. You just need to listen carefully and they'll tell you exactly what's wrong." Those words echoed in her mind every time she looked at the troubled Mustang. The other students were preparing for their final practical examination, which would determine who would advance to the prestigious internship program with major airlines. Sarah knew she was already at a disadvantage. Her grades were excellent, but the instructors consistently gave her lower marks on practical work, claiming her unconventional methods didn't meet academy standards. She needed something extraordinary to prove her worth. One evening, while staying late to study in the hangar, Sarah overheard a conversation between Mr. Harrison and the academy director. They were discussing the Mustang's mysterious engine problems that had stumped 3 professional mechanics over the past month. The engine would start but would lose power unpredictably, making it too dangerous to fly. The director was frustrated because they had promised the donor that the aircraft would be flight-ready for an upcoming air show, and time was running out. As Sarah listened from behind a tool cabinet, she realized that the symptoms they described matched exactly what her grandfather had told her about a specific carburetor issue common in these vintage engines. The problem wasn't mechanical failure, but rather a subtle fuel mixture problem that required an experienced eye to detect. She knew she could fix it, but approaching the instructors with her theory would likely result in ridicule or punishment for eavesdropping. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. This was her chance to prove that she belonged in this field, but it meant directly violating the Academy's most serious rule. The Mustang sat under bright lights, surrounded by ropes and warning signs, like a sleeping giant waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't let her fear of authority override her confidence in her abilities. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the safe thing to do. She began planning her approach carefully, knowing she would have only one opportunity to prove herself before facing the consequences of her actions. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the academy early, her heart pounding with nervous energy. She had spent the entire night researching everything she could find about P-51 Mustang engines, cross-referencing her grandfather's old maintenance manuals with modern diagnostic techniques. She was as ready as she could possibly be. But the real test would come when she put her hands on the aircraft that everyone else had been warned never to touch. The hangar was nearly empty at 6 a.m, with only the security guard making his rounds every hour. Sarah had timed his pattern perfectly over the past week, knowing she would have exactly 55 minutes of uninterrupted access to the Mustang. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the roped-off area, but her resolve remained firm. This wasn't about breaking rules. It was about solving a problem that nobody else had been able to fix. Sarah carefully lifted the rope and stepped into the forbidden zone surrounding the aircraft. Up close, the P-51 Mustang was even more magnificent than she had imagined. The polished aluminum skin gleamed under the hangar lights, and she could see her reflection in the propeller blades. But she wasn't here to admire the craftsmanship. She was here to diagnose a problem that had stumped professionals. She began her examination methodically, starting with the external symptoms she had observed from a distance. The oil stain beneath the engine was definitely growing, but it wasn't coming from the typical leak points that most mechanics would check first. Sarah ran her fingers along the engine cowling, feeling for vibrations or irregularities that might indicate internal problems. Her grandfather had taught her that engines communicate through touch as much as through sound. Opening the engine, cowling required removing several access panels, and Sarah worked quickly but carefully, laying out each screw and component in precise order so she could reassemble everything exactly as she found it. The Merlin engine that powered the Mustang was a masterpiece of engineering, but Sarah could immediately see the problem that had been overlooked by the other mechanics. The carburetor float chamber showed signs of inconsistent fuel levels, and the mixture control linkage had a subtle bend that was causing irregular fuel delivery. This wasn't the type of dramatic failure that would show up on standard diagnostic tests. It was the kind of problem that required understanding the aircraft's history and the specific quirks of vintage engines. Sarah smiled, remembering her grandfather's words about listening to what the machine was trying to tell you. As she worked to adjust the carburetor settings, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from across the hangar. Panic shot through her body like electricity, but she forced herself to continue working while listening carefully to determine who was coming. The footsteps were too heavy to be another student, and too irregular to be the security guard on his normal rounds. Someone was walking purposefully toward the Mustang. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The voice was stern, but not angry, belonging to someone Sarah didn't recognize. She looked up to see an older man in coveralls, probably in his 60s, with grease-stained hands and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the situation. This wasn't one of the academy instructors, and Sarah had never seen him before. Sarah straightened up, still holding a wrench, and decided that honesty was her only option. "I'm trying to fix the carburetor problem that's been causing the power loss issues," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "The float chamber isn't maintaining consistent fuel levels because of a bent linkage, and the mixture is running too rich during acceleration." The man's eyebrows rose slightly, and he stepped closer to examine her work. "And you figured this out how exactly?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Sarah explained her observations about the oil leak pattern, the engine symptoms she had overheard the instructors discussing, and her grandfather's experience with similar problems on Korean War-era aircraft. "Your grandfather was Miguel Martinez?" the man asked suddenly, his entire demeanor changing. When Sarah nodded, he extended his hand with a genuine smile. "I'm Frank Kowalski. I worked with your grandfather at Osan Air Base in 1952. He saved my life when he diagnosed a similar problem with my F-86 Sabre that 3 other mechanics had missed." Sarah felt the world shift around her as she realized that this chance encounter was far more significant than a simple case of being caught breaking rules. Frank explained that he was now the chief maintenance supervisor for the collector who owned the Mustang, and he had been called in as a last resort to solve the engine problems that had stumped the Academy's mechanics. "Your grandfather taught me that the best mechanics aren't the ones who follow procedures blindly," Frank said, examining Sarah's work on the carburetor. "They're the ones who understand that every aircraft has its own personality and needs individual attention." He paused, studying the adjustments she had made. "You've identified the exact problem we've been chasing for weeks." The security guard's footsteps echoed across the hangar as he began his next round, and Sarah realized that her secret mission was about to become very public. Frank noticed her concerned expression and chuckled softly. "Don't worry about getting in trouble," he said. "I have a feeling that by the time we're done here, you're going to be the hero of this story, not the troublemaker." Frank worked alongside Sarah for the next 30 minutes, impressed by her methodical approach and deep understanding of the aircraft's systems. Together, they completed the carburetor adjustments and performed a series of diagnostic tests that confirmed Sarah's diagnosis was absolutely correct. The fuel mixture was now properly calibrated, and the bent linkage had been straightened with precision tools that Frank had brought from his workshop. By 7:30, other students and instructors began arriving for the day's classes. Sarah knew that discovery was inevitable now, but Frank's presence gave her confidence that the situation might not end in disaster. As they finished reassembling the engine cowling, Mr. Harrison entered the hangar and immediately spotted them working on the forbidden aircraft. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Harrison's voice carried across the entire hangar, causing other students to stop and stare. His face was red with anger as he marched toward them, clearly prepared to deliver severe punishment to Sarah for her blatant violation of Academy rules. "Miss Martinez, you were explicitly warned never to touch this aircraft. This is grounds for immediate expulsion." Frank stepped forward before Sarah could respond, extending his hand to the furious instructor. "You must be Mr. Harrison. I'm Frank Kowalski, Chief Maintenance Supervisor for the aircraft's owner. I asked Miss Martinez to assist me with diagnosing the engine problems that your mechanics haven't been able to solve." The lie was delivered so smoothly that even Sarah almost believed it. Mr. Harrison's anger wavered as he processed this information. He had been expecting to discipline a rule-breaking student, but instead found himself facing a professional who outranked him in aviation experience. "I wasn't informed that anyone from the owner's team would be working on the aircraft," he said cautiously, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "Emergency consultation," Frank replied with authority. "The owner is concerned about the upcoming airshow deadline, and frankly, after reviewing your maintenance reports, I can understand why. This young lady identified the problem in less than an hour that 3 of your mechanics missed over several weeks." His words carried enough weight to silence Mr. Harrison's protests. Sarah watched in amazement as Frank continued to defend her actions while simultaneously critiquing the Academy's maintenance procedures. He explained the carburetor issue in technical detail, pointing out the specific diagnostic steps that had been overlooked by the previous mechanics. With each sentence, Mr. Harrison's expression shifted from anger to embarrassment to grudging respect. "The aircraft is ready for engine testing now," Frank announced, gesturing toward the completed work. "Miss Martinez's grandfather trained her well. She has an intuitive understanding of these vintage engines that's becoming increasingly rare in the industry." He turned to Sarah with a knowing smile. "Would you like to do the honors of starting her up?" The entire hangar fell silent as students and instructors gathered around to witness what was about to happen. Sarah had never started an aircraft engine before, but Frank guided her through each step with patience and expertise. Her hands moved confidently over the controls as she primed the fuel system, set the throttle, and engaged the starter. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that filled the hangar like thunder. But this time, instead of the irregular power fluctuations that had plagued previous attempts, the engine ran smoothly at all RPM settings. Sarah adjusted the throttle through its full range, and the engine responded perfectly, maintaining consistent power output without the hesitation or rough running that had made it unsafe to fly. Frank monitored the engine instruments carefully, nodding with satisfaction as each gauge showed normal readings. "Perfect fuel mixture, consistent manifold pressure, optimal temperature ranges," he called out over the engine noise. "This is exactly how a properly maintained Merlin should sound." After running the engine for several minutes through various power settings, he signaled for Sarah to shut it down. The silence that followed was profound. Every person in the hangar had just witnessed a 19-year-old student accomplish something that experienced professionals had failed to achieve. Mr. Harrison stood motionless, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. His star, mechanics, had been outperformed by a student he had consistently underestimated. Frank broke the silence by addressing the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed exceptional diagnostic work by someone who understands that being a great mechanic isn't about following procedures blindly. It's about listening to what the aircraft is trying to tell you and having the courage to trust your instincts." He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Miss Martinez has just solved a problem that could have grounded this aircraft indefinitely." The Other students began to murmur among themselves, some with admiration, others with jealousy. Sarah had gone from being the overlooked outsider to the center of attention in a single morning. But she knew that the real test would come in how the Academy administration responded to her rule-breaking, regardless of the successful outcome. Word of Sarah's unauthorized repair spread through the Academy like wildfire. By noon, students from other programs had gathered in the hangar to see the Mustang that had been fixed by the quiet girl everyone had ignored. The story grew, with each telling transforming Sarah from a rule-breaker into a legend. But with fame came scrutiny, and not everyone was pleased with the attention she was receiving. Dean Margaret Thompson arrived at the hangar with a stern expression and a folder full of disciplinary forms. As the head of Westfield Aviation Academy, she had built her reputation on maintaining strict standards and absolute adherence to safety protocols. A student's unauthorized access to a multi-million-dollar aircraft represented exactly the kind of incident that could damage the Academy's reputation with donors and regulatory agencies. "Miss Martinez," Dean Thompson said in a voice that commanded immediate attention, "regardless of the outcome of your actions, you deliberately violated explicit safety protocols and endangered valuable property. The Academy cannot overlook such behavior, even if your intentions were good." She glanced at Frank, who had remained in the hangar specifically to witness this confrontation. Frank stepped forward with a respectful but firm demeanor. "Dean Thompson, I appreciate your concern for safety and protocol. However, I think you should know that the aircraft owner, Mr. Richard Blackstone, has specifically requested to meet Miss Martinez. He's extremely impressed with her diagnostic skills and wants to discuss her future in aviation maintenance." The dean's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Blackstone, one of the Academy's most generous donors. "Mr. Blackstone has been informed of this incident?" she asked, clearly calculating the political implications of disciplining a student who had caught the attention of such an important benefactor. "He's driving here from Chicago as we speak," Frank replied smoothly. "He asked me to ensure that Miss Martinez receives proper recognition for her exceptional work. In 40 years of aviation, I've rarely seen such intuitive problem-solving skills in someone so young." He paused meaningfully. "Mr. Blackstone is particularly interested in supporting talented individuals who show promise in maintaining vintage aircraft." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. She had expected punishment, possibly expulsion, but instead found herself at the center of a diplomatic dance between Academy politics and donor relations. The other students observed from a respectful distance, sensing that they were witnessing something significant in the Academy's history. Mr. Harrison approached the group with obvious discomfort, carrying a clipboard with maintenance records. "Dean Thompson, I've reviewed our diagnostic procedures for the Mustang over the past month. Miss Martinez identified a problem that our standard protocols failed to detect." His admission was clearly difficult, but his professional integrity demanded honesty. Her unconventional approach was more effective than our systematic methodology. The dean studied the maintenance records while considering her options. Disciplining Sarah would satisfy protocol requirements but might offend a major donor who was praising the student's abilities. Ignoring the rule violation would set a dangerous precedent, but could strengthen the Academy's relationship with Mr. Blackstone. The political calculation was complex, but the practical benefits of Sarah's actions were undeniable. "Miss Martinez," Dean Thompson said finally, "your violation of safety protocols was serious and cannot be ignored. However, your diagnostic skills and successful repair work demonstrate exceptional competence." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The Academy will place a formal reprimand in your file, but you will also receive special recognition for outstanding technical achievement." Sarah nodded, understanding that this compromise allowed everyone to save face while acknowledging her abilities. The reprimand satisfied the rule followers, while the recognition pleased the donor and validated her skills. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was practical politics that kept all parties reasonably satisfied. Frank smiled and pulled out his business card, handing it to Sarah. "Mr. Blackstone's company operates one of the largest vintage aircraft restoration facilities in the country. We're always looking for mechanics who understand these older machines." He winked conspiratorially. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you accomplished today." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by classmates who had previously ignored her. Some offered genuine congratulations, while others seemed motivated by curiosity about her sudden prominence. She handled the attention graciously, but remained focused on the larger implications of the morning's events. The Mustang sat gleaming under the hangar lights, its engine problem solved by someone who had dared to trust her instincts over institutional authority. Sarah realized that her actions had proven more than just her mechanical abilities. They had demonstrated the courage to act when action was needed, regardless of the potential consequences. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the day's events, she understood that her relationship with the academy had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just another student struggling for recognition. She had established herself as someone with unique skills and the confidence to use them when necessary. Richard Blackstone arrived at the academy the following morning in a vintage Porsche that matched his passion for classic machinery. At 72 years old, he had built a fortune in aerospace manufacturing and now dedicated his time to preserving historic aircraft. His collection included over 30 vintage planes, each maintained to museum quality standards by a team of specialists who understood the unique requirements of classic aviation. Sarah was called to Dean Thompson's office to meet the legendary collector, her nervousness evident despite her confidence in her mechanical abilities. Blackstone was shorter than she had expected, with silver hair and eyes that sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone who had never lost his childhood fascination with flying machines. He studied her with the same intensity she had seen him use when examining aircraft. "Frank tells me you learned about engines from your grandfather," Blackstone said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. "Miguel Martinez was quite a mechanic. I met him once at an air show in 1995, and he spotted a timing issue with my P-38 Lightning that 2 other mechanics had missed." He smiled warmly. Apparently, diagnostic intuition runs in the Martinez family. Sarah found herself relaxing as Blackstone shared stories about her grandfather's reputation in aviation circles. Miguel had been more respected than she had realized, with mechanics across the country seeking his advice on difficult problems with vintage aircraft. Learning about her grandfather's legacy filled Sarah with pride and a deeper understanding of the skills he had passed down to her. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Martinez," Blackstone said, leaning forward with obvious excitement. "My restoration facility is working on a 1944 B-25 Mitchell bomber that's been giving us trouble for 6 months. The engines run, but there's a vibration problem that's affecting the entire aircraft. My best mechanics are stumped, and we're running out of ideas." He explained that the B-25 was scheduled to participate in a memorial flight honoring World War II veterans, making the deadline particularly meaningful. The aircraft was mechanically sound, but the persistent vibration made it unsafe for extended flight operations. Traditional diagnostic methods had failed to identify the source of the problem, and Blackstone was desperate for fresh perspective. "I'd like you to visit my facility this weekend and take a look at the Mitchell," Blackstone continued. "If you can identify the problem, I'll offer you a full-time position after graduation, along with specialized training in vintage aircraft restoration." He paused meaningfully. The starting salary would be considerably higher than what most academy graduates receive from commercial airlines. Sarah's heart raced as she processed this incredible opportunity. Working with vintage aircraft had always been her dream, but she had assumed such positions were reserved for mechanics with decades of experience. Blackstone was offering her a chance to turn her passion into a career, working with some of the most historically significant aircraft in existence. Dean Thompson, who had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement, cleared her throat diplomatically. "Mr. Blackstone, Miss Martinez is still a student with several months remaining in her program. While we appreciate your interest in her abilities, she needs to complete her education before considering employment opportunities." Blackstone waved dismissively. "Naturally, she'll finish her studies first. But I want her to know that exceptional talent doesn't go unrecognized in my organization." He turned back to Sarah with a serious expression. "The aviation industry needs mechanics who understand that these machines have souls, not just specifications. That kind of intuitive connection can't be taught from textbooks." The meeting continued for another hour as Blackstone shared details about his restoration projects and the challenges of maintaining aircraft that were decades old. Sarah absorbed every word, asking technical questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of vintage aviation systems. Her confidence grew with each exchange, and she began to see herself as a legitimate professional, rather than just a struggling student. When Blackstone finally stood to leave, he handed Sarah a business card made from brushed aluminum that resembled aircraft skin. "Call Frank tomorrow to arrange your visit this weekend. I have a feeling that B-25 is going to teach us all something important about problem solving." He shook her hand firmly. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." After Blackstone left, Dean Thompson remained in her office with Sarah for several minutes, discussing the implications of this opportunity. The dean admitted that in her 20 years at the academy, she had never seen a student receive such recognition from someone of Blackstone's stature in the aviation community. Sarah's unconventional approach had opened doors that traditional academic performance rarely accessed. As Sarah walked back to the hangar that afternoon, she noticed that other students looked at her differently now. The whispers and sideways glances had been replaced by respectful nods and genuine interest in her opinions during technical discussions. Her demonstration of competence had changed not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. The Mustang still sat in its place of honor, but now it represented more than just a forbidden challenge. It had become the catalyst for Sarah's transformation from an overlooked student to a respected professional with a promising future in vintage aircraft restoration. Saturday morning found Sarah driving through the Illinois countryside toward Blackstone's restoration facility, her toolbox in the passenger seat, and her mind racing with anticipation. The facility occupied a converted World War II training airfield, with multiple hangars housing aircraft in various stages of restoration. As she approached the main gate, Sarah could see the distinctive silhouette of a B-25 Mitchell bomber parked on the tarmac. Frank met her at the entrance with a warm smile and obvious excitement about the challenge ahead. "The Mitchell has been our puzzle for 6 months," he explained as they walked toward the aircraft. "She runs beautifully on the ground, but there's a vibration that starts around 1500 RPM and gets worse with increased power. We've checked engine mounts, propeller balance, even the landing gear components. The B-25 was magnificent, its twin engines and distinctive twin-tail design representing the peak of 1940s aviation engineering." Sarah circled the aircraft slowly, observing details that might provide clues about the vibration problem. Her grandfather had taught her that solutions often revealed themselves to patient observers who looked beyond the obvious. As she examined the aircraft more closely, Sarah noticed something that the other mechanics had apparently overlooked. The propellers were perfectly balanced and properly timed, but there was a subtle difference in the blade angles between the left and right engines. The variation was so small that it would be invisible during static testing, but it could create significant harmonic resonance during flight operations. "Has anyone checked the propeller pitch synchronization between the two engines?" Sarah asked, running her hands along the blade edges. "The governors might be set correctly individually, but if they're not perfectly matched, you'd get exactly the kind of vibration you're describing." She pointed to tiny differences in blade wear patterns that suggested the propellers weren't working in perfect harmony. Frank's eyes widened as he processed this observation. "We balanced each propeller separately and timed them according to specifications, but we never verified that they were synchronized with each other during operation." He called over 2 other mechanics who had been working on the aircraft, explaining Sarah's theory about harmonic vibration caused by improperly synchronized propellers. The solution required specialized equipment to measure propeller phase relationships during engine operation, tools that were available at the facility but had not been used for this particular diagnostic challenge. Sarah worked alongside Frank and his team for the next 4 hours, making micro-adjustments to the propeller governors until both engines operated in perfect synchronization. When they finally ran both engines at full power, the difference was immediately apparent. The vibration that had plagued the Mitchell for months had completely disappeared, replaced by the smooth harmonic sound of perfectly matched engines. The aircraft sat steady on the tarmac, no longer shaking with the irregular oscillations that had made it unsafe for flight operations. Incredible, Frank said, shaking his head in amazement. 6 months of diagnostics and we never thought to check propeller phase synchronization. Your grandfather's training really did prepare you for problems that stump conventional mechanics. He made notes in the maintenance log while Sarah cleaned her tools, still processing the satisfaction of solving another challenging problem. Blackstone arrived at the hangar just as they were completing the final engine tests, his face lighting up when he heard the smooth sound of the synchronized engines. That's exactly how she's supposed to sound, he said with obvious pleasure. Frank, prepare the flight certification paperwork. This Mitchell will be ready for the memorial flight after all. He turned to Sarah with genuine admiration. In 2 days you've solved problems that experienced professionals couldn't crack in months. That's not luck. That's exceptional diagnostic ability combined with the courage to trust your instincts. He paused, watching as the engines continued to run smoothly. I meant what I said about the job offer. My organization needs mechanics who understand that these aircraft are more than just machines. As the sun set over the airfield, Sarah stood next to the restored B-25, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 days earlier, she had been a struggling student worried about proving herself worthy of a place in aviation. Now she had not only demonstrated her abilities but had earned the respect of industry professionals and secured a promising career in vintage aircraft restoration. The memorial flight took place the following week, with the B-25 performing flawlessly, as it led a formation of World War II aircraft in tribute to fallen veterans. Sarah watched from the ground, knowing that her diagnostic work had made this meaningful ceremony possible. The aircraft that had challenged an entire team of mechanics was now serving its intended purpose, carrying the legacy of those who had served their country. 6 months later, after graduating with honors from Westfield Aviation Academy, Sarah Martinez began her career at Blackstone Aviation Restoration. Her office wall displayed her grandfather's old Air Force maintenance manual alongside her academy diploma, constant reminders of the heritage and education that had shaped her approach to aircraft maintenance. The girl who had once been warned never to touch the forbidden aircraft had become the mechanic that other professionals called when conventional solutions failed. Her story became legendary at the academy, inspiring future students to trust their abilities and have the courage to act when they recognized problems that others had missed. The Mustang still sat in the hangar, but now it wore a small placard crediting Sarah Martinez with solving the engine problems that had stumped everyone else. Sometimes the most important lessons come not from following rules, but from knowing when breaking them serves a greater purpose.